The vote stood at 11 to 9 against the king, and no one in the Right Hall pretended that a narrow loss was still a loss. Griffin Valewood felt the sound of it in her ribs before she understood the words. Council voices crashing against carved stone while winter wind pressed at the high windows and made every torch gutter sideways. Bastian Nightshade sat on the blackwood dais with his hands flat on the arms of the throne, expression unreadable, as if the room had handed him weather instead of rebellion. Lyra stood 3 rows behind Griffin, head lowered in a display of family grief that would have looked convincing to anyone who had not grown up learning each of her performances by the tilt of her chin. Evomar watched from the ambassador bench with the calm interest of a man waiting to see whether his investment would mature or burn. Rook, small in a borrowed guard cloak, shook beside Commander Torin Voss and still held his oath bead in one fist so tightly that his knuckles had gone pale. The oath scribes scratched every word into waxed tablets. Under Crown law, Right Hall proceedings bound the throne as surely as any battlefield treaty, which meant this was no theater and no temporary storm. Bastion had cancelled the diplomatic marriage terms that secured grain and soldiers from Mars' border provinces, and the council had answered by trying to fence him inside his own crown. If Griffin spoke now, she would give the hall what it needed to burn Lyra or burn her, and there would be no path back to quiet life either way. Bastion's gaze found her through the chaos, steady and direct in a way that made the room contract to one narrow line between them. Griffin remembered the first time he had looked at her like that, remembered the words he had given her when she had expected mockery and prepared for humiliation. She had not trusted him then. She barely trusted what she felt now. The chamberlain called for testimony. Griffin took one step toward the witness stone. Lyra finally raised her head and met her eyes, and in that instant Griffin saw the calculation underneath the sorrow, the old message Lyra had taught her at 14 in front of a whole pack. The one that said survival belongs to those who bend quickly and smile while they do it. Griffin had spent 5 years obeying that lesson on the surface and refusing it in private. The refusal had brought her to this floor. To understand why a king at 29 chose open conflict for an Omega who had once sworn she would never be chosen, the story had to go back to 737 AU, to a winter rite where Griffin was 14 and still believed humiliation ended when ceremonies ended. At the pack placement rite, each adolescent stood before elders and received rank assignment, household duty, and sponsorship. All of it public, all of it recorded. Griffin had entered the circle with hands sweating inside ceremonial wraps, and Lyra's fingers warm at the back of her neck in what looked like support. Lyra was 19 then, already polished, already skilled at knowing which elder favored caution and which favored cruelty masked as order. The elder who read Griffin's assessment listed patience, endurance, and scent sensitivity, then paused long enough for murmurs to swell before adding poor social adaptability and insufficient bond pliancy. Griffin did not understand the phrase until the sponsor panel declined her one by one. She waited for Lyra to stand, because Lyra was her guardian after Griffin's parents died in the harvest fever. Lyra kept her eyes lowered and said nothing. Rejection at the right meant unplaced status, no household claim, and assignments no one else wanted. It also meant everyone in the district had watched it happen. Griffin bowed because protocol required it, walked out of the circle because movement was easier than breathing, and learned before the night ended that shame could become routine if repeated often enough. Morning errands started at stables and ended at kitchens. No one struck her. No one needed to. Exclusion did cleaner work. Lyra explained it later with soft concern, telling Griffin that visible ambition would only worsen scrutiny, and that an unplaced Omega survived by seeming harmless. Griffin listened because hunger punished argument, and because she was 14, still trying to believe the person who fed her might also protect her. Weeks turned to months. She watched ranked trainees drill in yard rings she was forbidden to enter, and she started mimicking their footwork in empty corridors when everyone slept. Commander Torin Voss discovered her by accident in 738 AU, though he would later say accidents rarely happened in palaces because everybody watched everybody. He was War Master then, broad-shouldered, severe, known for cutting excuses down to bone. Griffin expected punishment when he saw her copying a disarm sequence with a broom handle. Torin asked where she had learned the third pivot. She answered honestly, from watching his left flank drill through kitchen lattice. Torin's mouth did not soften, though something in his posture shifted. He told her she was late for training and met her before sunrise the next day. He listed her on records as an unranked sparring aide under training exemptions, a legal category almost never used for Omegas and usually reserved for injured veterans rebuilding balance. The entry kept curiosity low and protected her from immediate disciplinary removal. It also gave him cover to train her without announcing why. For 4 years, she met him 5 dawn sessions each week, in rain, frost, and summer heat. While the palace still smelled of banked embers and sleeping hounds, Torin taught stance before speed, breath before force, and ethics before victory. Griffin learned how to end a fight quickly, how to avoid fighting when pride demanded it, and how to choose the injuries she could live with when no clean options remained. Her body hardened, her rank did not. By 742 AU, Griffin was 19. Lean with scarred knuckles she kept hidden under stable gloves. She still worked low-status tasks by day, partly by necessity, and partly because visibility invited questions she could not afford. Rook, a younger Omega stable hand with a quick grin and a habit of humming while he swept, became the only person who saw the gap between her public meekness and the alert stillness she carried beneath it. He never asked for details. He started bringing her water before sunrise. Frost Month arrived with banners announcing the King's Choosing Assembly, a formal event where ranked houses presented candidates for service, alliance, and occasionally, royal notice. For most Omegas, the assembly was distant spectacle. For Griffin, it became a trap the moment Lyra appeared in the stable corridor carrying official entry papers and smiling like an ant preparing a festival surprise. Lyra said Griffin had been nominated for exhibition dual placement, an honor, a chance to rehabilitate old perceptions. Griffin read the forms twice. The nomination signature was Lyra's guardian authority mark, legal and unchallengeable unless Griffin filed a dispute with the same council that had watched her rejection at 14. Humiliation bait, polished, and lawful. Lyra leaned close and murmured that refusing would confirm everyone's suspicions about instability. Griffin signed because refusing on paper meant losing even the sliver of agency she still held in person. Torin found her after evening drills and listened without interruption while she explained what Lyra had done. He wanted to challenge the nomination through military channels. Griffin shook her head, aware of how fast administrative fights could expose his 4 years of hidden training and end both their positions. Torin's jaw tightened. He changed strategy, drilling her through likely bracket patterns until midnight and teaching her the one rule he repeated before every hard match: choose what you can live with tomorrow. The assembly hall filled with ranked houses, diplomats, and court observers wrapped in winter silks. Griffin stood in an unadorned tunic among polished candidates and felt every old nerve from 737 AU wake up at once. She scanned exits on instinct. Her name was called for a 3-round exhibition against a ranked beta challenger from House Brindle, a fighter known for crowd-pleasing aggression and clean record. Lyra applauded first. Griffin stepped into the ring and saw the king for the first time not as distant symbol on coinage, but as a man seated above the pit with his war council, still and attentive in a way that made the rest of the dais look restless by contrast. Bastian Nightshade was 29, black coat over ceremonial steel, expression calm enough to unsettle people who relied on visible tells. Griffin dropped her gaze because staring at rulers invited notice. Round 1 opened fast. The beta pressed hard with shoulder checks and sweeping hooks designed to overwhelm lighter opponents. Griffin yielded ground by inches, redirecting instead of matching force, then caught his wrist at the angle Torin had drilled until her forearms screamed and sent him to one knee without damaging the joint. Crowd noise split between jeers and surprise. She released immediately and reset stance. Round 2 turned uglier when the challenger targeted her ribs with rising knees and clipped her temple. Warm blood reached her eyebrow. Griffin tasted iron, heard Lyra laughing softly 2 rows up, and remembered every elder who had looked through her at 14. She used the memory like ballast, anchored her breath, and waited for overextension. When it came, she trapped his ankle and forced a controlled fall that dislocated pride instead of bone. Round 3 became silence. Even the gamblers stopped shouting because outcome now hinged on decision, not stamina. Griffin could finish with a choke that would leave the beta unconscious for minutes and earn approval from a crowd that respected domination. She chose a shoulder pin and restraint lock, held exactly long enough for the referee count, and stood down before the final bell finished echoing. Victory arrived without spectacle, which confused everyone who expected an Omega either to collapse or overcompensate. Protocol required the winner to present for selection acknowledgement. Lyra's plan assumed Griffin would be flushed with relief and vulnerable to public framing as unstable once attention intensified. Griffin climbed the dais steps with legs that felt hollow and stopped 6 paces from the throne. The Chamberlain asked whether she submitted herself to choosing authority. Griffin heard her own voice answer before caution could intervene, steady, clear, carrying farther than she intended. "No, Your Grace, I will not be chosen." The hall reacted like she had struck a sacred bell with bare hands. Counselors leaned forward. Lyra's fan snapped shut. Bastion studied Griffin for one long breath that felt like judgment approaching. Griffin prepared for reprimand, expecting the kind delivered with public elegance and private ruin. He rose instead, descended 1 step, and spoke only 6 words. "I understand why you refuse that." He returned to his seat and ordered the next candidate called, ending the moment before anyone could interrogate it. Griffin bowed and left on legs that no longer trusted the floor. She interpreted his response as controlled dismissal, the way powerful men avoided creating scenes around inconvenient people. The audience, seeing the line of his shoulders and the way his gaze tracked her exit until doors closed, understood something she did not. His restraint had cost him effort. By nightfall, the palace had converted her refusal into rumor. Some said the king had pitied her. Others said he had marked her for discipline. Lyra visited Griffin's quarters carrying broth and concern, suggesting that unprocessed trauma had made Griffin impulsive and that the family would absorb embarrassment if Griffin remained quiet for a few weeks. Griffin thanked her and said little, aware now that silence could be weapon or shield depending on who held it. In the days that followed, Bastion did not claim what she had refused, and he did not corner her with rank to force proximity. When duty required her report, he addressed her as Valewood, asked for her account first, and left without testing the boundaries she had set in public. Griffin read the restraint as distance she could not decode, while the court read a king pursuing respect before he pursued anything else. The following week forced all ambiguity to collapse. A border council convened with Ambassador Ivo Mar to finalize grain shipments and troop support. The same alliance that had long included expectation of Bastion's treaty marriage to Mar's niece. Griffin attended as sparring aide assigned to perimeter logistics, technically invisible, practically useful. Rook worked nearby carrying dispatch satchels between clerks and guard posts. Mid-session, a commotion broke in the outer corridor, one guard shouting fire while another ran opposite direction. Griffin sensed stage timing before she could prove it. She moved toward Rook, who had paused at a side door where smoke suddenly thickened from an overturned brazier. A masked attacker emerged through the haze with a short blade angled low for abdominal strike, fast and trained enough to hit an unarmored Omega before alarm fully spread. Griffin intercepted the first thrust with her forearm bracer, absorbed pain, and drove the attacker into the stone balustrade. He twisted free and slashed at her face. She ducked, swept his leg, and pinned his wrist as he tried to swallow a poison capsule. Torrhen's lessons moved through her without thought. Preserve witness when possible, disable when necessary. She struck the jaw hinge, forced the capsule out, and called for irons while Rook clung to the wall, shaking. Guards dragged the assailant away. Griffin turned to check Rook and glimpsed Lyra at the far end of the corridor speaking in urgent whispers to Ivo Mar, before both separated at once when they noticed movement. The exchange lasted seconds, long enough to imprint. Griffin said nothing in public because accusation without proof would be framed as paranoia, exactly the trap Lyra preferred. She got Rook to safety and memorized everything she had seen. That evening, Bastion summoned Torrhen, not Griffin, and issued a private order that never entered official logs, assign covert guard rotation to Griffin Valewood and stable hand Rook. No uniforms, no visible shadowing. Griffin learned of it only when she found unfamiliar footsteps echoing hers in empty hallways and realized someone was always close enough to intervene. She interpreted the protection as containment, the king keeping unstable variables under watch. The audience knew he was securing targets someone wanted removed. Investigation began quietly because public inquiry would alert conspirators. Torrhen handled physical evidence from the attacker and discovered payment tokens minted in Mars border provinces. Queen Mother Selene Nightshade reviewed diplomatic correspondence and found coded amendments inserted into grain schedules, clauses that would have increased dependence on Mars supply routes within one winter. Griffin, restricted from direct inquiry, collected details from service corridors and messenger patterns where officials assumed she was background. Rook became the hinge. He had seen more than Griffin realized during the council attack, including Lyra passing a seal ring to Ivo's aide 2 nights earlier near the archive stair, and from a linen alcove, he had also heard Lyra tell Ivo that entering Griffin in the assembly gave them the perfect opening to brand her unstable once she refused in public. He admitted he had kept quiet because speaking against a guardian aristocrat as a young Omega often ended with punishment for insolence. Griffin listened, then made the decision she had avoided since 14. She would bring him to oath scribes and stand beside him publicly. Fear shifted from fog into task list. Before she could act, Lyra struck first. A petition reached the council claiming Griffin displayed unstable aggression, citing the assembly refusal and corridor violence as evidence of Omega volatility. The filing requested confinement for assessment until spring. Ivo's office endorsed the petition under diplomatic security concerns. Griffin read the copy with numb precision and saw the architecture clearly: discredit witness, isolate target, restore treaty path. Bastion called an emergency advisement with council and crown family. Griffin was not invited, which fed her suspicion that power would close ranks around convenience. Hours later, Torrhen arrived at her quarters with guarded relief and bruised knuckles from someone else's doorframe. The confinement motion had been paused by direct royal instruction pending formal hearing in Wright Hall. Bastion had also ordered Lyra and Ivo restricted from private contact with court guards. Griffin's misread deepened because protection without explanation looked like strategic delay, not trust. She confronted Bastion 2 nights later after training, finding him alone in the East Gallery where snowlight turned stone silver. Her words came sharper than protocol allowed. She asked whether he intended to use her as leverage in treaty negotiations, whether his understanding at the assembly had been calculated to keep her compliant. She expected reprimand. He gave her something harder to absorb. Bastion held her gaze and answered in short declaratives. No leverage, no calculation, no compliance expected. He said his first intended marriage had been arranged at 23, years before his accession stabilized. His betrothed sold his troop routes to a rival faction to secure her own family's elevation, an act that cost him 32 soldiers and nearly lost the Northern Pass. He survived, took the crown, and learned that intimacy became entry point for enemies when trust outran verification. For a brief moment, the narrative shifted with him because this was the crack he never offered in public. Bastian had recognized Griffin's refusal at the assembly because he had once stood in ceremonial light while others negotiated his future body like a treaty clause. He understood the instinct to reject selection before selection became erasure. He had said 6 words because 6 were all he could trust himself to speak without breaking the armor that kept his kingdom intact, and he chose to prove those words through restraint before asking for anything in return. Griffin heard the story and felt her anger lose its easy shape. She did not forgive instantly, did not melt into gratitude, did not confuse vulnerability with virtue. She asked why he protected Rook as well as her. Bastian answered that protection followed evidence, and Rook had been targeted once already. He added one quieter line: "You never protected only yourself in that corridor," and that was the point no council filing could erase. The hearing date was set in Wright Hall, with oath scribes present, testimony binding under Crown law. Lyra spent the intervening days visiting old allies, invoking family honor, and framing Griffin's training as a predatory aberration hidden by Torrhen's ambition. Ivo pressed border delegations to warn of grain shortages if diplomatic trust collapsed. Queen Mother Celine advised caution to avoid triggering trade panic, and her caution landed on Bastian like another weight he already knew by name. On the morning of the hearing, Frost filmed every outer stair. Griffin arrived in plain court gray with no family crest, only Torrhen's training knot braided at her wrist under sleeve where few would notice. Rook stood beside her in a newly fitted witness tunic that made him look younger, not older. She told him he could still step back and no one would blame him. He shook his head and said blame had never fed him either. Proceedings opened with Lyra's counsel presenting a tidy narrative: unstable Omega, illegal combat conditioning, risk to court safety. Griffin listened while old humiliation pressed at her sternum in familiar rhythm. When called, she testified to the assembly duel, the corridor attack, the observed exchange between Lyra and Ivo, and the sequence of events that followed. She kept her voice level, answered only what was asked, and refused invitation to speculate where facts sufficed. Lyra took the stand next and cried on cue, describing years spent sheltering a difficult cousin, then suggesting Griffin's fixation on status had produced delusions. Griffin watched counselors lean toward pity and felt the floor tilt toward old outcomes. The obstacle resolved only when Rook stepped forward trembling and offered his own testimony. Seal ring handoff at archive stair, Lyra's corridor whisper to Ivo after the attack, and the line he heard from hiding: "I entered her in the assembly, so one refusal would let us lock her away." Ivo challenged Rook's credibility as a servant child. Torrhen answered by producing the attacker's payment tokens and guard logs placing Ivo's aid at restricted corridors during the exact window Rook described. Celine added intercepted code letters aligning with the same dates. The case tightened from rumor into structure, and Lyra's composure finally fractured when oath scribes read back her prior statements against contradictory records in front of full court. Verdict came before dusk. Lyra Valewood was convicted of conspiracy to frame Crown witnesses and incite unlawful confinement, sentenced to imprisonment under house arrest protocols pending transfer to the Inner Keep. Ivo Mar's diplomatic immunity prevented detention, though his endorsement was declared bad faith and his access to counsel suspended immediately. He requested departure papers before moonrise and left with half his delegation in bitter silence. The courtroom victory solved only one layer. Mar's alliance withdrawal triggered the council revolt that opened this story, 11-9 against Bastian, after he formally canceled treaty marriage terms attached to grain and military support. Councilors argued he had exchanged regional stability for personal fixation. Bastian listened through every accusation, then refused compromise proposals that required reopening marriage negotiation with Mar. The cost was public, immediate, and politically dangerous. That night, Griffin went to the old training ring where Torin had first corrected her stance, and found Bastian waiting in the snow with no guard within earshot. He told her the council would likely force emergency ration planning by winter's end unless alternate grain contracts were secured. He also told her he would not reinstate the treaty marriage even if council pressure threatened his throne coalition. His voice stayed even, though cold had reddened his hands. He named the hesitation this decision resolved with explicit clarity. As long as his crown depended on a marriage bargain, claiming her would read as impulse and expose her to endless legitimacy attacks. By canceling the bargain first, he removed political convenience from the equation and made an honest choice possible, even at high cost. Griffin heard the logic, and for the first time her disbelief in her own worth loosened enough to let trust enter. Bastian asked nothing that night. He said only that Wright Hall would reconvene at first bell, and any claim he made would be made before the same witnesses who had seen her rejected at 14. If she wanted distance, he would give it and defend it. If she wanted partnership, she would need to step into fire with him because the council would not stop contesting her place after one declaration. Choice, not instinct alone. Griffin did not sleep. She walked palace corridors until dawn and visited the stable where Rook once hid from louder boys, then the kitchen threshold where she had stood carrying trays during meetings that decided her life without naming her. She understood what accepting Bastian would cost: permanent visibility, political hostility, and responsibility beyond personal survival. She understood what refusing would preserve: relative safety inside smaller rooms and no chance to rewrite rules that had shaped her wound. At first bell, she entered Wright Hall in formal black and silver, not as bait and not as hidden aid, while murmurs followed like weather. Torin stood at her right shoulder in full commander regalia, restored by royal order pending final confirmation. Selene occupied the Queen Mother's seat with expression carved from caution and reluctant respect. Rook waited near the witness row, now flanked by two young guards assigned to Omega Protection Detail Prototype. Bastian rose when she reached the witness stone. He did not perform tenderness for the room. He spoke in the same short declaratives that had carried him through war briefings and treaty disputes. Griffin Valewood, I recognize the bond. I choose to honor it. I claim you before Crown and Council as my consort, with full rights, and I accept all political cost that follows from this claim. No instinct had made those sentences inevitable. His will did. Silence held for one breath, two, while old hierarchy searched for a way to reject what had just been spoken. Griffin felt the memory of 14 flicker through her, the circle of elders, Lyra's lowered eyes, the certainty that no one would stand when standing mattered. She stepped forward and answered in her own terms, not as surrender, and not as rescue. I choose you with full knowledge of the cost, and I will stand beside you if we change this court together. The bond recognition, involuntary and ancient as pack instinct, moved through both of them like a current under ice. The claiming remained voluntary and public, anchored by spoken vows and scribe record. Counselors objected, several at once. Selene stood before the chamber could fracture again and acknowledged Crown law plainly. The king's designation required no council consent, and proceedings were binding. Opposition shifted from denial to negotiation because legal ground had moved under their feet. Over the next weeks in late 742 AU, Bastian and Griffin faced the practical aftermath that romantic legends rarely show. Mar grain contracts ended on schedule, forcing emergency procurement from inland cooperatives at higher transport cost. Torin coordinated escort routes to secure shipments through mountain passes vulnerable to raiders. Griffin sat in logistics councils, translating low-rank labor realities for officials who had never counted stable rations by hand. Resistance remained constant, progress became measurable. Council members who opposed the claim tested boundaries through procedure, delaying appointments, questioning Griffin's authority, leaking dismissive commentary to city houses. Griffin answered with work and visibility. She launched open spar sessions where rank restrictions were relaxed under supervision, arguing that defensive competence reduced guard burden across all classes. Participation started small, then expanded when two merchant daughters successfully disarmed a drunken extortionist in Market Square, using techniques from Session 3. Rook became first enrollee in the new Royal Guard pathway for low-rank youth, a program Griffin proposed and Bastion funded by reallocating ceremonial expenditures that had once financed redundant pageantry. The program's design addressed the specific obstacle that had trapped him and others: talent without sponsorship. Training now linked to documented merit, not family seal access alone. Rook's grin returned in increments, usually when he landed a clean pivot Torin had called impossible for week 1. Torin's reinstatement became official by winter's end, followed by promotion to Chief War Master with mandate to standardize exemption pathways for non-traditional trainees under strict safety oversight. He accepted with a nod that looked almost like relief. Griffin knew what the promotion resolved for him: years of professional isolation for training the wrong person in the eyes of old hierarchy. Merit had finally been defended in the same hall where it had once been mocked. Celine's acceptance unfolded gradually, shaped less by speeches than by observed consistency. She invited Griffin to private policy reviews and tested her with hard questions about ration equity, border deterrence, and court optics. Griffin answered from lived experience and admitted uncertainty where certainty would have sounded polished and false. Celine began introducing her as consort in closed meetings before doing so publicly, a subtle shift that mattered more than any staged endorsement. Bastion's mask continued to crack in deniable moments the court pretended not to see. He cut off a duke who mocked Omega Command aptitude during supper and reassigned the duke's levy review to a stricter auditor. He asked Griffin whether her shoulder had healed after drills and waited for the answer rather than issuing physician orders outright. He still spoke with clipped authority, yet the space around those words changed: less command, more regard. Their private relationship developed with the same structure as their public work: deliberate, negotiated, honest about wounds that did not vanish on schedule. Griffin still flinched at sudden ceremonial attention. Bastion still tracked exits in any crowded room and slept lightly when political pressure spiked. They built routines that made closeness durable, shared dawn training twice a week, evening policy debriefs, and one untouchable hour after midnight where Crown documents stayed closed and silence was allowed. When spring reached the city in 743 AU, crocus shoots appeared along south walls where snowmelt ran warmest, and Wright Hall convened again for formal swearing. Griffin stood before the same witness stone that had once held her rejection and was sworn as Queen Consort and Commander Liaison, authority defined in law, not favor. The oath language included oversight of rank access reforms and defense training standards, clauses she had helped draft line by line. The final vote that day did not erase opposition, though it recorded acceptance. Counselors who had fought hardest against her now calculated within a new paradigm where refusal carried legal and political costs they could no longer externalize onto unranked bodies. Bastion watched the tally without triumph. Griffin watched the scribes seal the record and felt something older than ambition settle in her chest. The wound from 14 answered at the level where it was inflicted, in public, witnessed, binding. After ceremony, she found Rook in the outer courtyard trying to stand at attention, while Spring Wind kept tugging his new guard cloak sideways. He whispered that the cloak still felt borrowed. Griffin adjusted the clasp and told him titles always felt borrowed until your work wore them into shape. Rook considered this and nodded like he had been handed statecraft instead of fabric advice. For the first time in years, she laughed without checking who might punish it. Lyra remained imprisoned under house protocols in the inner keep, appeals denied after review of oath records and corroborating evidence. Griffin visited once, not for reconciliation and not for revenge, simply to close the loop herself. Lyra asked whether becoming consort had made Griffin feel chosen at last. Griffin answered that she had chosen first. In the ring when she refused to be used. In court when she testified. In hall when she accepted claim with conditions. She left before Lyra replied. Evomar sent one final dispatch from the border provinces, proposing renewed grain talks separated from marriage terms. Bastion accepted negotiations through neutral envoys with transparent pricing and rotating oversight. A framework Griffin and Selene co-authored to prevent dependency traps that had nearly broken the court. Trade resumed at lower volume and higher accountability. Military support became contractual service rather than familial leverage. Stability returned slower than gossip predicted and held better once it arrived. At dusk, on the day her swearing was entered into permanent record, Griffin and Bastion stood on the west parapet above training yards where mixed-rank recruits ran first formation under Torrens' command. The city below carried ordinary sound, market haggling, forge hammers, children arguing over game stones, life uninterested in court mythology except where policy touched bread and safety. Griffin leaned on cold stone and finally let herself ask the question she had held since Frost Month. She asked why he had spoken only 6 words at the assembly, why not more, if he had understood from the beginning. Bastion considered before answering, aware she wanted truth instead of romance script. He said 6 words were all he trusted that day, because if he had offered comfort publicly before earning her trust privately, he would have repeated the same kind of ownership she had refused. Understanding had to become action over time or remain vanity, and the answer to what he meant by "I understand" was every boundary he kept until she chose him back. Griffin absorbed that and recognized the full sequence of what had changed between them. His restrained response had resolved her expectation of mockery and made wary curiosity possible. His protection order had resolved immediate physical risk and made investigation possible. His revelation of betrayal had resolved her misread of pure coldness and made emotional trust possible. His cancellation of treaty marriage had resolved political convenience and made authentic claim possible. Her testimony against Lyra had resolved divided loyalty and made partnership equal. The story closed where the genre always promised it would close, not at first recognition and not at ceremonial declaration, but at the point where both had paid the full cost and chosen anyway. Griffin had entered this world as an Omega publicly rejected in 737 AU and trained in secret through 742 AU because merit had no lawful door for her. She stood in 743 AU as Queen Consort and Commander Liaison because she opened that door herself and walked others through. Bastion had ruled with disciplined distance because betrayal once taught him attachment could become a blade held to his throat. He still wore armor in council, still measured risk like breath, yet he no longer hid behind convenience when choice demanded exposure. The king who had once accepted politically useful loneliness chose a consort the hierarchy dismissed and defended that choice through revolt, treaty loss, and procedural siege, until law and practice aligned. When night settled over the palace, Griffin returned to the training ring for one last set, habit stronger than ceremony. Bastion joined her without escort. They sparred lightly, trading holds that had once meant survival and now also meant trust. Torches burned low. Snowmelt dripped from eaves in a steady rhythm. Nothing about the movement looked like conquest. It looked like 2 people learning, again, the shape of choosing each other in public and in private, with no one left to overrule it.